Hey everybody, this is chapter 10 of Tony Cliff's The Nature of Stalinist Russia. Chapter 10 is titled The Class Struggle in Russia. The headings include: It is wrong to speak of a Stalinist epoch. The initial direct influence of industrialization and collectivization on the relation of forces between the proletariat and the bureaucracy. The pressure of the totalitarian police machine. The military victories of Russia. The bureaucracy creates its grave digger. Here we go. 1. It is wrong to speak of a Stalinist epoch. The rise of the bureaucracy to become a ruling class expresses the fact that the historical mission of the Stalinist bureaucracy, which is to establish capitalism in Russia, is already exhausted on an international plane, but not yet exhausted on a national plane. At the same time, the bureaucracy, by relying on planning, the element of the invading socialist society, which the bureaucracy nevertheless applies to its capitalist mission of the accumulation of capital. Again, Cliff kind of using the word capital to just means of production here, and that's what is basically being said, not value accumulation, right? Cliff says that the main imperative of the state is to produce use values for war that never enter into any kind of competitive exchange relationship. So what you can only assume, and capitalism for Cliff does not include, in the USSR, include like the internal operation of the law of value, or like internal competition between no internal competition in the social division of labor, right? No competition between autonomous or relatively autonomous economic units. So I think there's a very good case to say what Cliff means here is not capital in the sense of uh, value becoming more value, right? Capital having an inherently commercial mercantile character, right? It's the purchase and sale of things. Um, is Purchases and sales are wrapped up into its constitution in a way that Cliff doesn't seem to refer to. So I think what he's definitely saying here is accumulation of means of production. At the same time, the bureaucracy, by relying on planning, an element of the invading socialist society, which is nevertheless applies to its capitalist mission of the accumulation of capital, in a few decades oversteps the traditional historical course with the bourgeoisie of the West, which the bourgeoisie of the West took about 200 years to accomplish. Relying on elements of the future society to fortify relations of the past, the bureaucracy undermines these relations of the past themselves very quickly, and in so doing prepares a new glorious edition of the proletarian revolution on a much stronger basis than in 1917. The fact that in its youth as a ruling class the bureaucracy has the totalitarian characteristics of decaying, aging capitalism proves that it was born as a historical anomaly with no future. This is corroborated by the fact that the bureaucracy is compelled to carry on a vast propaganda campaign against bureaucratism, to pose as the defender of the workers against the bureaucracy. This shows that the bureaucracy has a guilty conscience, but more especially that it is a usurper lacking historical legitimacy. The capitalist state ownership raises the ear of the masses. From the beginning of the bureaucracy's constitution as a class, therefore, the sword of Damocles hangs ominously above its head. Whereas the capitalists of the 16th to 19th centuries could visualize a glorious future with himself as the representative of humanity as a whole, the Stalinist bureaucracy today, fulfilling the historical function of this capitalist, cannot but feel that its roots are in a temporary and passing concatenation of national and international circumstances, hence the totalitarianism. The terror of the bureaucracy against the bureaucrats themselves indicates the anomalous position of this hybrid. In traditional capitalism, the competition between the capitalists ensures that each will be as efficient as possible. In socialist economy, the social consciousness, the care for the interests of society, the harmonious relations between people is the basis of efficiency, which is higher quantitatively and different qualitatively from that prevailing in capitalist economy. The Stalinist bureaucracy is a result and a cause of the lack of harmoniousness between people, of class and personal antagonisms, of the unlimited egotism prevailing. They are on the one hand the motive at the base of planned socialist economy, the control of producers in the interests of the producers themselves. I don't know if that's the right sentence. It says the control of producers in the interests of the producers themselves. I don't know if there's a typo here or something, but it's a weird sentence. It might be supposed to be control of production, but I'm not sure. I'll just read the sentence as it said in the actual page. Therefore, on the one hand, the motive at the basis of planned socialist economy, the control of producers in the interests of the producers themselves, does not exist in Russia and cannot ensure the efficiency of production. On the other hand, the direct connection between the efficiency of the individual enterprise and the income of its directors that exists under individual capitalism also does not exist. This only means of The only means of ensuring efficiency remaining in the bureaucratic state is a terror directed against the individual bureaucrats. The terror has an additional function besides this. As Seliga writes, quote, this original method of calming the anger of the people, the terrorist purges, reminded me of Marco Polo's report of the Mongol emperor who reigned in Pekin at that time. It was customary once every 10 or 15 years to deliver over to the crowd the minister most abhorred by it, which allowed the emperor quietly to oppress his people for the next 10 or 15 years. What I saw in Russia was to bring this Mongol emperor repeatedly to mind. End quote. Seliga. As a much deeper abyss exists between the Stalinist bureaucracy and the masses than ever exists in history between rulers and ruled, it is of the utmost importance to the bureaucracy that scapegoats be found. Although the bureaucracy was born with all the marks of age of a declining class, it would be too great a simplification to say that every step forward of the productive forces, every addition to the working class, will directly and immediately undermine the position of the bureaucracy. No, reality is much more complicated than that. New section, section 2. The initial direct influence of industrialization and quote, collectivization on the relation of forces between the proletariat and the bureaucracy. In the first 5-year plan, the number of workers in Russia increased very rapidly. While in 1928 the number of people occupied in manufacturing industries and the extraction of minerals was 3 million, in 1932 it reached 8 million, an increase of 160%. The overwhelming majority of the working class are thus raw elements just come from the villages, not yet educated and organized by the process of social production. At the same time, the quick industrial development and the acute shortage of technicians, skilled workers, officials, etc., opened the gates of the bureaucracy to many workers of long standing. And of course, the more experienced and intelligent the worker, the more possibility he had of rising in the hierarchy. These two factors, sorry, that's just a side note. I've said this before in other videos in my Russian history class. There's this in the historiography. There's this notion of the affirmative action state, right? So kind of like the while the USSR remained structurally a pyramid and a hierarchical structure, like under traditional capitalism, there was a degree to which it was fairly open and to the the working class and peasantry. In fact, the state tried to encourage them becoming members of the bureaucracy, or like what's the word? Just basically trying to include kind of, and that's what the idea of the affirmative action state. Not only was it open, but it was actively encouraged to have people from the working class and the peasantry come into positions of power and have access to education. Obviously, when when a pyramid is diversified, that doesn't mean it's not a pyramid any longer. Anyway, These two factors of the dilution of the working class by raw elements and the exodus of militant elements from it were in the different historical circumstances in the US a grave impediment to the rise of an independent workers' movement some decades ago. But in Russia, the difficulties on the path of the workers' movement during the 5-year plans are much greater than American difficulties, not only because of the pressure of the secret police, because of the weariness of the masses after many years of superhuman effort, because of the ideological disorientation which appears both as a result and cause of the weakness of the Russian workers' movement at this time, but also for another reason. This is the creation by the bureaucracy of a layer of elite among the oppressed. This is one of the most efficient weapons the oppressor can wield in its oppression of the masses. When Napoleon said that even the heaviest cannons could not stand up against empty stomachs, Napoleon was not entirely correct. Empty stomachs under circumstances lead not to revolt but to submission. Such was the case in the first years of the industrialization by the Stalinist bureaucracy. Victor Serge said, quote, "A vast misery will spring from its the bureaucracies and policy. But in this misery, the tiniest material benefits become precious. It will now suffice to offer a worker a plate of soup, the least bit nourishing, and a shelter the least bit habitable, in the winter for him to attach himself to the privileged amid the general destitution. In that way, a stratum of subordinate bureaucrats will be formed in the enterprises, in the party cells, and in the villages, where the collectivization is to result in a new differentiation between leaders and led. Mound the former will around the former will gravitate a clientele eager to serve. The misery will consolidate those who conjured it up." End quote. Victor Serge. New section: The pressure of the totalitarian police machine. One cannot overestimate the difficulties which the police machine makes for the independent organization of the workers in Russia. The working class is atomized, and any attempt at building up any independent organization whatsoever, or giving expression to the desires of the masses, is brutally suppressed. The workers are compelled to belong to organizations led and controlled by the state and teeming with the state spies. The combination of propaganda and terror designed to ensure the bureaucracy's monopoly of propaganda puts no limits to the lies it spreads, to the terror against the soul of the masses. The state's organization, even of the leisure time of the masses, driving them to mass demonstrations and public meetings, compelling them to debase themselves and sing the praises of their oppressors. All these weapons of the bureaucracy make the molecular process of the organization and education of the workers very difficult. There is every indication that even the experienced, cultured German proletariat would have needed many years, perhaps some decades, till its souls have succeeded in smashing. Until its coals have succeeded in smashing. Is that a word? Is that a typo? Yeah, no, that's supposed to be souls. Oh, no, could. That's what's meant. Okay. It's not supposed to be coals, it's could. There's every indication that even the experienced, cultured German proletariat would have needed many years, perhaps some decades, till it could have succeeded in smashing the oppressive Nazi machine with its own strength. It is significant that even in the hours of Nazi Germany's greatest military defeat, no mass revolts of workers broke out on the home front. In connection with this, one must not overlook the important effect Ilya Ehrenberg's chauvinistic propaganda had in helping the Nazis to cement the cracks in the wall of German, quote, national unity. I don't know who Ilya Ehrenberg is, but Wikipedia says Ilya Ehrenberg lived from 1891 to 1967, and was a Soviet writer, revolutionary journalist, and historian. Ilya Ehrenberg was among the most prolific and notable authors of the Soviet Union. Ilya Ehrenberg published around 100 titles. Ilya Ehrenberg became known first and foremost as a novelist and a journalist, in particular as a reporter in three wars: First World War, Spanish Civil War, and Second World War. Ilya Ehrenberg's incendiary articles calling for violence against Germans during the Great Patriotic War won him a huge following among frontline Soviet soldiers, but also caused much controversy due to their perceived anti-German sentiment. Ilya Ehrenberg later clarified that his writings were about, quote, German aggressors who set foot on Soviet soil with weapons, end quote, not the whole German people. The novel The Thaw gave its name to an entire era of Soviet politics, namely the liberalization which occurred after the death of Joseph Stalin. Ilya Ehrenberg's travel writing also had great resonance, and to an arguably greater extent, so did his memoir, People, Years, Life, which may be his best known and most discussed work. The Black Book, edited by him and Vasily Grossman, had special historical significance. It describes the Holocaust in the Soviet Union, the genocide which was committed against Soviet citizens of Jewish ancestry by the Nazis. It was denounced as, quote, anti-Soviet and banned from publication. It was first published in Jerusalem in 1980. In addition, Ilya Ehrenberg wrote a succession of works of poetry. Um, as a side note from myself, that is, it makes sense that that book would have been banned by the Soviet Union because the Soviet Union and East Germany and all those other states, uh, the the focus of the narratives about World War II and the victory in World War II was about um, fascism, which is Nazism was just viewed as a form of fascism, not as something very um, National Socialism not having specific qualities, especially the um, core central place anti-Semitism in Nazi ideology. Uh, they kind of viewed the like all the kind of like memorials and things of that sort were called like victims of fascism, right? So like in places where like lots of Jews were killed on the grounds of being Jews, there'll be like monuments, for instance, to like the deaths of Soviet citizens, right? So there was definitely like a degree to which like after the fact um, of uh, after World War II, there was a degree to like that. Not that the Soviet Union by any means whitewashed the brutality of the Nazis or anything like that, but whitewashed the specifically anti-Semitic features of the Nazis from their public memory, right? So it wasn't that like this. Not to say that they said like wouldn't deny the Holocaust or anything like that, but definitely viewed like announcing or like commemorating the specifically Jewish loss of life uh, by the Nazis was viewed in some ways like particularistic and reactionary, right? Um, and just kind of like this is it's a general theme of like you know um, it's an important theme just in general about like the degree to which people relativize the Holocaust, right? This is kind of like a certain form, I would say, perhaps about of like uh relativization of the Holocaust, right? Like wiping out the uh wiping out the specifically anti-Semitic character, or kind of like putting aside or kind of like blurring out the specifically like anti-Semitic character of National Socialism and anti-Semitism being like a core like tenet of National Socialism, kind of like whitewashing that out, just saying the Nazis were bad to everybody. The Nazis were so horrible to Soviet citizens and everybody that they conquered, right? Um, Kind of like isolating. I think that's a form uh, of like relativization of the Holocaust. The other form, would be, I think, obviously like the right wing relativization of the Holocaust, right? That uh, you know the the we've paid disproportionate attention to the crimes of National Socialism, when in fact Stalin killed however many million people, and did all kinds of pursued all kinds of atrocities, right? Kind of like trying to like downplay the significance or the specificity of the Holocaust by comparing it to the crimes of Stalinism, right? Um, that's another form of Holocaust relativization. And then more recently is kind of like um, trying to turn uh, the Holocaust, make the Holocaust really no different than than just like imperial conquest or something like that. Really, it's really about like using the Holocaust as like in order to like sort of downplay its significance and importance and the special features of it, in order to like draw attention to to some other crime committed in history, uh, and has the effect of kind of like, in a certain sense, like poo-pooing the severity and unprecedentedness and like the truly like um, the extreme nature of the Holocaust. Uh, it's a very I think there's an example of all these kind of like you know ways that people kind of just like, the Holocaust is like putting too much attention on it is so particularistic, and really um, masks in some capacity other atrocities, which obviously are very bad. But there's this like, I think there's usually kind of like a malice. At least I think like a certain, in my opinion at least, I think there's usually often a certain kind of like malice involved in it too. Instead of like you can like, obviously this channel is full of critiques of really really deep substantial critiques of Stalinism and the barbarities of it. But most of the stuff that I read is never trying to like you know use the Holocaust as like, it's not so use the Holocaust as like a some kind of comparison tool to say like, like everyone pays attention to the Holocaust, but did you look over here? No one's doing that kind of thing. But it seems like that was very, I don't know. You're probably not listening to this to hear me ramble on about Holocaust memory. Um, Very poorly, I might add. But yeah, I think this is interesting. Sorry, just it came across this Wikipedia um, article and learning about the Black Book. It's very interesting. Anyway, in connection with this, one must not overlook the important effect Ilya Ehrenberg's chauvinistic propaganda had in helping the Nazis to cement the cracks in the German, quote, national unity. The raw Russian proletariat, the overwhelming majority of whom but a few years ago come from the villages, of whom less probably than 10% knew the conditions under Tsarism, when trade unions were illegal, when the different workers' parties had a legal press, while will find the utmost will find the utmost difficulty in learning the ABC of organization and socialist ideology under the rule of Stalin. Section 4. The military victories of Russia. An additional factor which strengthened the rule of the bureaucracy was its military victories. They were the result of various factors. Firstly, the absolute suppression of the masses allowed Stalin to devote a larger portion of the national income than the countries of the West to war aims. He could, for instance, achieve the, quote, miracle of the evacuation of Russian industry, end quote, by transferring millions of workers to the East, housing them in holes in the ground. Secondly, police suppression ensures quiet on the home front. Another, quote, advantage Russia had over the democratic capitalist countries. The same two factors caused the absolute supremacy of Germany over France and Britain, which is put to an end only by the cooperation of the American industrial machine, producing 4 times as much as Germany, and the Russian. While the Russian military victories were to a large extent the result of the, quote, quiet on the home front, the depression and despair of the toiling masses, They in their turn become an important factor in the stabilization of the Russian regime. To make an analogy, one cannot underestimate Nazi Germany's victories in Saar, Austria, Sudetenland, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and France as a factor influencing the psychology of the German masses. New section: The bureaucracy creates its gravedigger. The initial result of the industrialization and collectivization in Russia was to strengthen the position of the bureaucracy. After a few years, an opposite process began. Never step forward of the productive forces undermines the position of the bureaucracy. In the first 5-year plan, the number of workers employed in manufacture and mining rose from 3 million to 8 million, a rise of 160%. In the second 5-year plan, it rose only from 8 million to only 10.1 million, a rise of 25%. The third 5-year plan planned an increase of 11.9 million in 1942, a rise of 16.7%. Thus, despite the liquidation of many of the workers in the purges, the number of veteran workers with many years of participation in the process of production behind them is steadily growing. At the same time, the gates of the bureaucracy draw together, decreasing the recruitment of the best elements among the workers into the bureaucracy. This can be shown by a few facts. It can be shown that from the middle of the 1930s, the direct promotion of workers from the bench to administrative position almost ceases. Higher education is then placed beyond the grasp of the workers. In 1938, the total number of students in higher institutions was 533,000. Of this number, 181,000 were manual workers and the children of manual workers, 33.9%. 115,000 were peasants and the children of peasants, 21.6%. And 225,000 were salaried employees and specialists and the children thereof, 42.2%. As the total number of the higher layer of the bureaucracy is about 2.5 to 3 million, it is highly improbable that of the 225,000 salaried employees and specialists and the children thereof, there were many from the ranks of the lower bureaucracy. An important step towards the closing of the gates of the bureaucracy is the decree of the 2nd and 12th of October 1940, which fixed fees for education in secondary schools, 8th, 9th, and 10th grades of elementary schools, and technicums in colleges. Fees range from 150 to 200 rubles a year for secondary schools to 300 to 500 rubles a year for colleges. To indicate the largeness of this sum, we need but remember that in 1940 the average wage and salary of everyone from chairwoman to director was 335 rubles a month. The great majority of the workers did not earn more than 150 rubles per month. Hence, the fees for the 8th, 9th, and 10th grades of elementary schools amounts to about a month's wage of a worker. Of the colleges and technicums, 2 to 3 months. Footnote: in Britain, the 8th and 9th grades were compulsory and free even before the Labour government came to power. The Labour government added the 10th. End footnote. Bertram D. Wolfe justifiably wrote about this decree, quote, "This decree does not, quote, go back to the bourgeois world," end quote, but to the last monarch of 19th century Russia, Alexander III, and his Minister of Education, Delyunov, who issued the celebrated ukaz, which is like a decree, which reads, quote, the children of coachmen, servants, cooks, laundresses, small shopkeepers, and such like persons should not be encouraged to rise above the sphere in which they were born, end quote. End quote. Bertram D. Wolfe. The crystallization of the proletariat due to the dwindling stream of raw elements coming into it and the dwindling stream of experienced elements going out of it is a process of the greatest importance. The historical task of the bureaucracy is to raise the productivity of labor. In doing this, the bureaucracy enters into deep contradictions. In order to raise the productivity of labor above a certain point, the standard of living of the masses must rise, as workers who are undernourished, badly housed, and educated are not capable of good production. The bureaucracy approaches the problem of the standard of living of the masses much in the same way as a peasant approaches the feeding of his horses. Quote, how much shall I give in order to get more work done? End quote. But workers, besides having hands, have heads. The raising of the standard of living and culture of the masses means to raise their self-confidence, increase their appetite, their impatience at the lack of democratic rights and personal security, and their impatience at the bureaucracy which preserves these burdens. On the other hand, not to raise the standard of living of the masses means to endanger the productivity of labor, which is fatal for the bureaucracy in the present international relations, and also to drive the masses sooner or later to revolts of despair. The bureaucracy increases the working class on the basis of the highest concentration history has known, and try as it may to bridge the abyss between the concentrated wage labor and concentrated capital, try as it may to veil it under the slogan of, quote, socialist property, the bureaucracy is bringing into being a force which will sooner or later clash violently with it. The fact that in the few years after the industrialization and, quote, collectivization, when the working class was yet young and relatively raw, Stalin was compelled to be entirely totalitarian and make such mass frame-ups as have no precedent in history, indicates the quick tempo at which the class struggle in Russia develops. In the countries of capitalist democracy, and to a large extent even in Tsarist Russia and the colonial countries, the class struggle of the proletariat initially takes the form of partial, quote, peaceful, organized, and, quote, planned economic struggles. In Stalinist Russia, because of the brutal police oppression, such struggles are excluded. Here, as in the armies of the capitalist countries where the soldiers are continuously under the whip of martial law, the molecular process of crystallization of mass opposition to the rulers does not receive clear, direct external expression. Only when conditions have become unendurable and it becomes clear to the masses that a decisive victory is possible, are they able to join battle. For the Russian masses today, to join battle is even more difficult than it was for soldiers in Tsarist Russia. The Tsarist soldiers rebelled only after the Tsarist soldiers saw that the mass of people was in revolt. The barricades built by the workers gave the soldiers confidence in the people's strength and inspired them to revolt against their officers. In Russia today, there is no group of people which is not under closer surveillance than ever the Tsarist army was. Only therefore, when the anger and resentment embedded in the hearts of the masses culminates till it is ready to burst, will the masses break out in revolt. A proletarian revolution in the West can obviously accelerate this process to an incalculable extent. The class struggle in Stalinist Russia must inevitably express itself in gigantic spontaneous outbursts of millions. Till then, it will seem on the surface that the volcano is extinct. Till then, the omnipotent sway of the secret police will make it impossible for a revolutionary party to penetrate the masses or organize any systematic action whatsoever. The spontaneous revolution in smashing the iron heel of the Stalinist bureaucracy will open the field for the free activity of all the parties, tendencies, and groups in the working class. It will be the first chapter in the victorious proletarian revolution. The final chapter can be written only by the masses, self-mobilized, conscious of socialist aims and the methods of their achievement, and led by a revolutionary Marxist party. Okay, so that is the end of Tony Cliff's The Nature of Stalinist Russia, Chapter 10, The Class Struggle in Russia. It's also the last section that I'm be reading. It's the last section of the whole book of Tony Cliff's The Nature of Stalinist Russia. So thanks for listening.